What is up, Homebrewed Christianity listeners? This is Tripp, and Nathan and I are sitting on my back porch recording podcast intros.
Yes, we are.
Because, I just had a brand new baby.
Congratulations.
Yeah, well, so this episode is an extremely special episode, and that's because Adam Clark is returning to the podcast. Adam Clark is a professor from Xavier University, specializing in black theology, and in this lecture that we're releasing on April 4, if you're listening to it the day it comes out, was a part of a really wonderful event we hosted at the Hatchery, which is a school I work at in LA. It was called Third Rail Theology, Race, Class, White Privilege in the Church. And Adam did the first talk. It was so good. I told him then, I said, I'm going to save it and let's release it on the 49th anniversary of MLK's assassination.
Which is today. So just know, if you're like, this is your first time listening and you say, where did the actual host go? Adam has been on the podcast a bunch of times. So if you're smart, go to the podcast post for this. You can click around listening to interviews I've done with Adam. There's a really cool interview that Adam did with Ebony who about 12 Years a Slave. Adam's also currently writing the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Salvation, how to avoid eternal conscious torment. I believe there's a talk available podcast episode.
Yeah, there's also, look, on Theology Nerd Podcast, there's a discussion he has about it. So Adam is a huge partner, friend of the podcast. He's writing a book in the series. That's why I feel cool just telling you in advance. This is nothing like a normal podcast. It's not an interview. It's him just bringing the theological heat. And, so like in the middle of this lecture, I had like teared up, wrote 3 or 4 pages of notes, and have thought about it since then. So just know this is the goods.
Yeah, this is powerful. So before we get into that, I just want to remind everyone that this month, if you're a member of Homebrewed Christianity Community, those that donate every month to keep this around, get access to all sorts of stuff, be a part of the secret Facebook group, make sure you visit the secret Facebook page, because we are sharing with everybody the Theology Nerd Boot Camp I did with John Cobb, Jay McDaniel. It's like straight up process Theology Nerd Boot Camp. You can get all 4 sessions. I think it's like 6 hours in there, and just nerd out. Next time you're on a road trip and you're like, you can skip all the stuff I say. Just go straight to the Cobb and McDaniel stuff. You'll be like, Tripp's talking. That's nice. But John Cobb's about to talk. And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, like I sat and watched John Cobb listen to me for an hour and a half when I gave my big talk. And then I know he's up next. And I'm like, I'm about to get creamed. Yeah. Intimidating.
So, yeah, it was intimidating. Luckily, John's extremely nice.
Yeah.
And
amazing. So if you want access to this and you're not a Homebrewed community member, it's really easy. Just become a Homebrewed community member. Just go to homebrewedcommunity.com.
There you go.
And you can get a sweet ecclesiastical title.
Oh, yeah.
All kinds of cool perks and stuff. Secret Facebook group. That's where you get access to this stuff. So,
yeah. And
we're a lot like PBS,
Yeah.
It's listeners like you that help keep the podcast going.
That's true. Listeners like you. It's also how I paid for my health insurance.
Which is very important now that you have
a third kid.
Yeah, a new baby.
People are like, the other day I've gotten a couple of emails recently where they're like, so, you teach full time at the Hatchery and then you do all the podcast stuff. And, like that's a lot. And I said, have you ever tried to live at the beach in Los Angeles?
You need to.
Yeah. You gotta always be hustling. But, so the podcast, community group is also a place where you can give input and things on, where we're going, what we're doing. The other thing I was going to say is that our friends at the Center for Process Studies, which is like the center that collects process philosophy, engaging like every discipline whatsoever. They are wanting to connect with student ministers, youth ministers. So we are putting together a free video class on open and relational youth ministry this spring. And like that, like it's literally like you'll get everything for free. There'll be video lectures I'm doing about different topics in youth ministry, how to think it through, along with a bigger session that goes through how I did confirmation, the confirmation process, which is a challenge for every progressive youth minister. And it also kind of goes through how you think about building community, relationships, and continuity in the group, developing a culture of intentionality and such, so that the group can grow and you don't feel like you are basically Jesus flavored YMCA. Which I know a lot of youth ministers always struggle with. Like, how do you explain to people we really need to be here in order to build the community, and then you feel like you're just stuck playing games. So
yeah,
what we're going to do, we'll have the video lectures, but we'll also have a group, which will all be youth ministers that are wrestling with these ideas and questions, sharing resources and stories and support. So if you want to join that, you can go to homebrewedchristianity.com and just click the link in the middle of this post. But if you're driving or doing dishes, you can also just text Open Youth
to 44222.
Yeah, no space between the word open and youth. You just text Open Youth
to the number 44222.
Yes, and then you'll get an email and such.
Yeah, well, all the details. Or you could just go to tinyurl.com/openyouth. Either way.
Mm-hmm. So that's right. What you're about to hear is Adam Clark from Xavier University talking about Martin Luther King, the challenge of dealing with race and class and white privilege in the church. It's just extremely powerful and beautiful talk. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what all of you think about it. In fact, if y'all give feedback and stuff, I'll have Adam back on the podcast and we can do a dialogue kind of interaction, questions and things. If topics or places you think the conversation could go happen, just let us know. And the last thing I think we should say is this was the day before Theology Beer Camp at the Hatchery. And right now we're preparing for summer Theology Beer Camp, which is we're taking it on the road. We're going to be in Oklahoma City in August, and we're going to be in Denver in August, having some theology nerd boot camps. Not theology nerd boot camps, theology beer camp.
Even better.
Yeah, because boot camps, that's cardiovascular exercise.
Yeah, we don't need any of that. This is
carb,
good for your soul, not necessarily for
drinking
your heart.
carbs.
Yes, exactly.
And Peter Rollins is going to be joining. So if you would like to come and help me witness to Peter Rollins while we day drink in front of people,
there may even be a demon cast out. Who knows? Mm-hmm. Who knows? You never know what's going to happen.
We don't know. We don't know. There's an open future here.
That's right.
So carpe diem yourself all the way to theologybeercamp.com. Get your tickets, tell your friends, and I just can't wait to see everyone there. The first one was so much fun that people that came were like, can we do this in our place? And the answer was yes.
Yes, we can.
And I know I've already had a lot of people on Twitter and the Facebook go, well, can't you come here? Can't you come here? Maybe. But if you go to theologybeercamp.com, there's also a little button you can click and tell us what city you're in.
Yeah.
And like, hey, you should bring it here. That way we can tell you if we're going to go there. Or if you think, I know the venue, or I know someone, I know a brewery. Yeah, then you can click that and we'll let you know. But I've had a couple of people ask if you want to end up hosting a Theology Beer Camp, you have to have gone to one before, because it's hard to explain what it is that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Until you've been to one.
Yes.
Because the most important part of it, on top of being nerdy and having delicious craft beer and all that kind of stuff, is it really is a giant party, soiree gathering of people that are nerdy, and are going to have fun. And it's an intense mixture of like getting serious and thinking, doing crazy, wild, fun things, and everything in between, and hanging out and all that kind of stuff. So it's important for us, for anyone that is ever interested in hosting it, to have gone to one before, so that, you know what's going to happen.
Exactly.
When it shows up. Because about 3/4 of the audio from the first one is not going to be on the internet.
No, it is not, for various reasons. But yeah, it was a great experience. I know everyone loved it, so everyone should come, be a part of it. And the more people come, the more likely we are to get Pete to sing karaoke.
Yeah.
So that right there should be incentive enough to do it.
That's what I'm talking about. And I'm pretty sure that he's guaranteed a very dramatic telling of one of the times he exorcised a demon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It came up in that Facebook Live.
It did.
People have been saying, I want to know more about this. And I'm like, Pete, I really hope you read that contract. there's a little fine line about demon stories and karaoke.
That's right. Yep. So and that's not going to be on the internet. So yeah, if you want to hear it, you got to come in person.
Guarantee you that Pete will not let us put that story on the internet. It'd just be among friends. All righty. Here's Adam Clark, and I will talk to you next week. Peace.
Welcome, everybody. Usually, Theology Beer Camp is so free-flowing and everything, but I'm a professor. I like to use a text because I like to make specific points. So I was trying to think about what's the best aspect of work to share with you. And since, King Day just passed, I wanted to use King's legacy as a metaphor, and even as a historical instance for looking at the issues of race, class, and white privilege. So I'm going to share with you some of the work I've been doing on King, and actually I've had about 3 or 4 King Day events that I participated in. I want to share with you some of the reflections I had on this. And I tentatively titled this The Radical King or The Dangerous King. February 1st, 1968, a huge terrestrial rainstorm hit Memphis, Tennessee. Sanitation crews, which were all black at the time, had to rush for cover. Since they weren't allowed in white hotels, they were assigned colored cabins. But the cabins were so small and dilapidated, 2 of the crew members couldn't fit. Sleeping outside wasn't an option because the storm was too bad. Going into a hotel wasn't an option because Negroes weren't allowed in white hotels. So they climbed back into their garbage truck and slept with the garbage. During the night, the garbage truck malfunctioned, and 2 men, Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death. And no one seemed to care that black men were being treated as garbage. Outraged, the sanitation workers called for a strike. But it failed because neither the religious community, the middle class, or the national labor movement supported it. Black men were being treated as garbage, and no one seemed to care. About a month later, James Lawson contacted King to come to Memphis to give attention to the plight of garbage workers. King, against the strong objections of some of his inner circle, pulled away from planning the Poor People's Campaign, which was in disarray at the time, to be in solidarity with the garbage workers. A week later, King was struck down by an assassin's bullet. Now, many of you have probably seen old pictures of black men with these iconic placards over their torso and down to their, over their necks and down to over their torsos. And the placards read, "I am a man. I am a man." But the full meaning of that message is, I am a man, not a piece of garbage. I am a man, not a piece of garbage. Each year, the nation gathers collectively to remember, commemorate, and celebrate the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm always puzzled by the range of claimants and admirers of his legacy. When you turn on the TV and you see political figures such as Donald Trump and Ted Cruz giving King Day speeches, and then you turn the channel and you see Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, and Clinton giving King Day speeches, Are they talking about the same king? How is it that conservative religious figures, such as Tony Perkins or Franklin Graham or Ralph Reed, identify their ministries with King's legacy, but so do progressive ministers such as Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and William Barber? Can the Tea Party and Black Lives Matter both claim King and be right? That's kind of rhetorical. We kind of know what's going on. But the point being is, what image of King is being constructed that makes everyone, even people who oppose the policies he supported, so comfortable with championing King? The popular image of King that's generated in most King Day celebrations, through educational institutions and the media, is deeply sanitized to make him more palatable to corporate interests and a risk-averse public. And they're risk-averse, especially when it comes to race. Cornel West refers to this as the Santa Clausification of King. An image of King as a wise man with toys in a bag, smile on his face, distributing cookies to black and white children. This tames the King legacy, robbing it of his bite and prophetic fire. If all King did was bring white and black children together to march hand in hand, why was he so despised during his life? If all King did was give a speech about a dream, how did that warrant death threats? Since when did espousing Christian love and speaking about racial tolerance get you labeled the most dangerous Negro in America by the FBI? The FBI doesn't place a bug in your bed, doesn't place listening devices in your phone, doesn't send letters to your wife and to yourself telling you to commit suicide or I'm going to publicly humiliate you. Dreaming alone doesn't provoke that type of response from the government. The radicalism of King has disappeared from our public consciousness. When you listen to people speak about King, you almost think they're talking about a guy who died from natural causes, not someone who was politically assassinated. During the course of his public life, which was 12 years, very short, King was stabbed once in the chest. His home was bombed 3 times. His mail brought a daily flow of death threats and obscenities. And he was often considered an extremist, a rabble-rouser, and a troublemaker. Even the president of his beloved Morehouse University didn't honor him till way later because they said he gets arrested too much, right? He's not really a good role model because he's always in jail. But in spite of all this, King worked 20 hours a day and made about 450 speeches a year. That's more than one speech a day. It's a lot. 365 days, 450 speeches a year. He was killed at the age of 39. That's really young. That's younger than Jay-Z. Younger than Nas. Even Barack Obama wasn't even a state senator at 39. Right? He started at 26. Soulja Boy is 26. Chris Brown is 27. Right? So you can see like the kind of disparity between what people think the maturity levels between kind of contemporary, not everybody, of course, but among people who are celebrities, that King was actually in Montgomery leading the bus boycott at 26 years old. But he paid a heavy cost because he burned the candle on both ends for 12 years. He suffered from depression and migraines. So much so that during his autopsy, when they cut him open, He died at 39, but his insides were 60 years old. That's tough. And it kind of reminds me of a lot of people who are in ministry and activism today, right? They burn the candle on both ends. They deal with depression. And King, to his credit, I mean, and one example that people don't really think about enough about King is that how he was able to still fight for the right despite his personal turmoil. Right? Like he could have just laid back. He actually wanted to just be a college professor and go back. He wanted to leave the movement. He said, "This is too. I didn't ask for this." He said they came to me and asked me, and I accepted, and now I'm caught up in the sweep of events. But he thought many times privately, like I could be teaching at some college somewhere and just taking care of my family and living a nice, comfortable life. I don't have to have all these people hating me. And it just gave like there was tremendous personal cost in King. But there was an attempt to reduce King. When you ask most people, or when I ask my class about what is King's significance, most people say civil rights for blacks or getting blacks the right to vote. Now, that's important, but that doesn't define his entire significance. King was about restructuring American democracy and reconstituting the American character, especially around race. And generally, you need the office of the presidency to do that, to make far and deep-reaching changes. For example, when you think of George Washington, you have the Bill of Rights. When you think of Thomas Jefferson, you have the Declaration of Independence. We have Lincoln, you talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, Roosevelt, New Deal, Obama, healthcare, although that's kind of in jeopardy now. But as a citizen, King was able to transform America as a citizen. He's the only non-president with a national holiday. There are more streets named after King than any other American citizen in America. 688. And the guiding principle of King's movement were equal souls for equal votes, right? If we're spiritual equality should equal social equality. That was a debate during slavery about not Christianizing African people, right? Like if you actually Christianize them, you say they're equally spiritually, everybody's children of God, then the social structure should reflect that. But what's happened is that that's what racism does. It's spiritually violent, not just socially violent. It does violence to the very concept of equal souls. So King can be seen as the greatest religious figure of the 20th century because the America he inherited was dramatically different from the America he helped produce. And the most visible evidence of his impact can probably be seen in the American South. For example, are there anybody in here who watches college football? Anybody here? Show of hands. Okay. National championship game between Clemson and Alabama. Now, imagine the Clemson and Alabama game without black players. Right? South Carolina, Alabama. Imagine North Carolina basketball without black players. Imagine Kentucky Wildcats without black players. During segregation, blacks couldn't enter into these universities. Right? So the whole thing of March Madness and college sports. No professional sports teams were in the segregated South. No Dallas Cowboys. No Atlanta Falcons. No Atlanta Braves. No Olympics could be in the South. No Super Bowls were in the South during the segregated South because there's so much stigma around that. Women couldn't serve on juries. There were no female rabbis until the 1970s. The first female Episcopal priest around the same time. There were no women at Harvard and Yale. Bilingual voting started as a initiative in the civil rights movement. The Physical Disabilities Act. The civil rights movement gave momentum to the labor movement, the feminist movement, inspired the ecology movement, the gay rights movement, which we call LGBT movement. Stonewall happened in 1969, right? So King's influence extended far beyond the black vote to reconstituting American democracy and most dramatically the South. And in this sense, you can kind of see King's movement represents the third rail. During slavery, the conservative position on slavery was we have to honor the law and we have the right to treat our slaves as harshly as we need to. The liberal position of slavery was, well, treat them with kindness. But the abolitionist position was, we need to eliminate slavery, right? That's the third rail, the elimination. During the Montgomery bus boycott movement in 1956, neither the Democrats or the Republicans supported that. It was a third rail. After the March on Washington, Kennedy didn't really want to pass the Civil Rights Act because he was deeply reluctant to offend his fellow Democratic senators, segregationist senators in the South. But the third rail pushed him to do that. In New York, you have the New York City train system. You have track A, you have track B, and then you have a third rail. And the third rail is the energizing rail. It's the power rail. The train doesn't move if the third rail is not ignited. And the King's movement was a third rail. It ignited things. And that's pretty much what the church is called to do, right? To be the thing that initiates and ignites things. So King pointed out there's a dramatic gap between the American ideal and American reality. America claims to be about freedom, justice, and equality, but the reality is far different. And what he tried to do was to help America be true to her own commitments. So when we honor King, we should recognize there are two kings. There's a safe king and there's a dangerous king. The king that's projected in popular media and most of our educational and political institution is the safe king. It's the domesticated king. King's public career started in 1956 and ended when he was assassinated in 1968. The public memory of King is focused only on the early king. That's the love your enemies king. The king who encouraged Southern blacks to be nonviolent despite white terrorism and brutality. The king who advocated beloved community and wanted people to be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That's King's emphasis till 1963, but he lived until 1968. And it's that gap between 63 and 68 that most people don't know about. The late king, that's the dangerous king or the radical king, was deeply disappointed in the rate of progress in America. We don't remember later in 1963, after the dream speech, he talks about how his dream turned into a nightmare. In the later part of his legacy, there was a paradigm shift. And we have to retrieve that king from the collective state of amnesia. This is the king who said, America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. That America is on the wrong side of history. He also said, we need to stop studying the Negro. We need to make some studies on these white suburban folks. Something's wrong about people who try to kill other people just because they want a hamburger, right? Let's study that. That's the pathology, not what's happening in black communities. And then he said most whites are unconscious racism. They're racist without even knowing that they're racist. That's King in the later part of his career. And the radical King is the most relevant image of King to explore the contradictions in contemporary American society. It is not courageous in the 21st century to be against whites-only drinking fountains or colored-only drinking fountains. It's not hard in our times to see the moral buffoonery of a Eugene Bull Connor or the ruthlessness of a Jim Clark, because this generation wasn't born where those things were normative. But when King challenged these ideas and practices, they were the norm. They were part of the fabric of the culture. They were the taken for grantedness of the day. The best way we can honor King is not by condemning the segregationist mentalities of the 1950s and the 1960s. It's by using his legacy to combat the injustices that are embedded in our taken for grantedness, in our norms, to challenge the dominant assumptions and racial presuppositions of our day. And ironically, many of those presuppositions are derived from King's dream speech. The dream speech is a watershed moment in the racial understanding for both conservatives and progressives. Yet each group identifies and interprets the moral vision of the speech differently. For conservatives, the ends part of the speech gives the most weight, unlocks the key. At the ends part, he says, let's not judge people by the content of their character, or let's judge by the content of your character, not the color of your skin. That's the most important aspect, and that's kind of the tagline. So for conservatives, color blindness is the dominant ethos of the speech. There should be no race consciousness in law. Any use of race by the government or by corporations is not an act of balance. It's an act of preference. In this conservative reading of the speech, or some variation of it, is the dominant ethos in America's public consciousness of race. It interprets the civil rights movement as a movement to replace race consciousness with race neutrality. But the content of your character remark and the I have a dream refrain is in the last part of the speech, the most flowery part. Most folks don't remember the first part. The first part, King was in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and he said, 100 years ago, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a beacon of hope to millions of enslaved Africans. The Negro, he says, 100 years later, the Negro still isn't free. 100 years. Blacks were crippled by segregation. They live in islands of poverty, and they are chained by discrimination. And in light of this American promise, instead of being swept under the rug, this ought to be a national shame. Then he spoke of the Constitution and the American Declaration of Independence as being promissory notes that were marked insufficient funds. So the Negro, he says, was issued a bad check, right, by these documents, and they came back marked insufficient funds. And that's the framing of the speech that the I have a dream remark should be understood. As a matter of fact, this speech could easily be renamed the Broken Promises speech, right? Because that's what he is really trying to get at. King conceived of the civil rights struggle as a way of collecting on promises already made and admonishing America to fix the problem it created. So the argument was not for legal uniformity, a one-size-fits-all approach, but for legal equality that took into account race, gender, and class factors in how justice is executed. He never intended to eliminate race or difference. He just didn't want people penalized or stigmatized for them. So 53 years later, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Jim Crow racism that King struggled against is no longer the dominant form of racism. It is no longer popular to enforce racial inequality by overt means. At least I used to think so before the election, but now I'm starting to wonder, like, what's going on here? But signs such as "No Negroes Welcome" or "Whites Only" are not socially respectable anymore. But there's a new type of racism, and some scholars call this colorblind racism. And its practices are much more subtle. Colorblind racism claims not to see race, yet manages to replicate racial hierarchy as effectively as the Jim Crow segregation of old. Colorblind racism allows many whites to safeguard racial interests without sounding racist. Race is spoken of by proxy. For example, George Wallace, the former segregationist governor of Alabama, promised to protect segregation. In one of his inaugural speeches, he famously pledged, "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." After it stopped being respectable to protect segregation, he developed a language of resentment and grievance to the government and any type of political activity that enforced equal citizenship through the doorway of race. The civil rights movement always came through the doorway of race and then extended to everybody. So what he did was he ridiculed the pointy-headed bureaucrats that force your children to go to school someplace through busing. He invoked distrust of the national media and said it had a racial agenda. He spread fears about the conspiracy to centralize all power in Washington. Now, that type of language sounds contemporarily chilling, right? That language evolved into big government is bad and taxes are wasted on the undeserving. And I don't like busing in my neighborhood. So no longer did you have to say, colored children belong in colored schools. You could just say, I hate busing or states' rights, and everybody knew what you were talking about. So shielded by color blindness, whites can express resentment toward people of color, criticize their morality, their values, their work ethic, and even when something is done to address the inequality, color blindness empowers many whites to claim they're victims of reverse racism. Now, not everybody who expresses this language has some type of racial animus. I don't want you to hear me saying that. You can principally believe that taxes are excessive and government is too intrusive. It has nothing to do with race. My point being is that the modern usage and the widespread popularity, especially in formerly segregated states, was a proxy for race. And America still has a problem. You know, we see all these kind of incidents where you see people of color and Muslims being beat up and people are yelling, Trump, 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 right? He's using it as a proxy for something. Why would you yell his name? In terms of that. Even while he denies that that's not something I would support. So colorblind ideology makes us less effective in trying to address inequality. How can we be a colorblind society where inequality is color-coded? You know, race shades almost every aspect of American life. And if it was fair, you would expect there's an equal distribution of both the misery and benefits of society. Right? Like if color didn't matter, then, you know, there'd be equal benefits for people of color and white people, and there'd be equal misery. But instead, blacks are overrepresented in those arrested, overrepresented in those who were prosecuted, overrepresented in incarceration and people charged with capital crime, and underrepresented in well-paying jobs, in educational attainment, in home ownership. Right? So this is part of the challenge of King. Now, most folks were introduced to the concept of socialism through the Bernie Sanders campaign, right? Did really well, talked about himself as a socialist, but King was socialist when socialism wasn't cool. He referred to himself privately as a democratic socialist. Democratic socialism is not Sovietism, not communism, as his critics often asserted. It is deep democracy. Not just democratizing our political affairs, but democratizing our economic arrangements. In 1966, King confided to his staff, you can't talk about solving the economic problem of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending slums without first saying profit must be taken out of having slums. There must be a better distribution of wealth. And maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. Now, he never said this publicly because of the kind of red and communist scare, but he would talk about this privately to his folks. King grew up in the South and came from a middle-income household. And it wasn't until 1964, when he went to Watts in Chicago, that he started to really see urban poverty. The kind of Southern poverty was a little different, right? Like, it was very racially stratified. My father grew up in a farm, and he would say, like, we were poor, but we always knew we could eat because we grew our own food, right? It's different but my mother, who was poor and grew up in urban poverty, she said, we had food insecurity all the time. We didn't know. We might not have dinner this night. So it's a different mindset. So King saw that the problem in Chicago's ghetto was not legal segregation, but economic exploitation. Slum housing, overpriced foods, low-wage jobs, because someone profits from its existence. Right? So someone's benefiting from the fact that people are poor. He referred to this as internal colonization. And the most powerful factor that fueled King's opposition to capitalism was from his biblical faith. King's faith taught him to bridge the gulf between abject poverty and excessive wealth. In this sense, he considered capitalism as an insult to his faith. King's ethics are firmly rooted in the tradition of the radical biblical prophets like Amos and Micah and Isaiah, who together proclaim that everyone, including the rich and the powerful, were to be governed by ethical principles such as mishpat, the foundational egalitarian justice, or I'm having trouble with pronouncing this Hebrew word, but sadiqwak, justice put into action, or hetshet, steadfast love, or emet, truthfulness in public or private life. The political implications of this ethical constellation are reflected by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah 16:5. A throne shall be established in hetshet, steadfast love, and on it shall sit in emet, truthfulness, a ruler who seeks mishpat, egalitarianism, and justice, and is swift to do tzedakah, put justice into action. Right? So from what we know of King, he was draped with the mantle of these prophetic ethics, which by definition are fundamentally opposed to the capitalist ethic of greed and dog-eat-dog-ism. Politically, this translated into King advocating for, he called it, a GI Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. The GI Bill created like the white middle class because it actually gave the government actually intervened to help people enter into middle class. But he said, we need to have a GI Bill or something modeled off that for the disadvantaged to enter into American Promise. And the government would have to act on that. He also advocated for a guaranteed income. He writes, I am now convinced that the simplest approach to the solution of poverty is to abolish it directly by what he referred to as a widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. So the early king believed that legislation would solve the problem of racial oppression. The radical king used words like redistribution or restructuring to discuss the struggle for justice. On one hand, he remarked, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. But according to King, that's only the initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed when they make their journey on life's highway. So he does a remix on the parable of the Good Samaritan. It says that that's an initial act if you just help the person. But we have to transform the entire road so it won't produce beggars. He says, we must do more than fling coins at beggars. We must come to see that the edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. So the first two phases of King's ministry were based on the themes of love and justice. The final phase, hope, becomes a dominant theme of his ministry. America's history, he remarks, need not be her destiny. Her history is not fated. The contradictions of life are not final. Human beings have the power to create a new history. And for King, the creation of a new society is not a fixed idea, but an organic one. Societies are either growing or dying, right? They're in dynamic flux. So the idea is not to just preserve democracy, it's to grow democracy. On Thursday, April 4th, 1968, King retreated to his room at the Lorraine Hotel. He was thinking about this sanitation strike, and he was thinking how human beings should not be treated as garbage. And he was working to create a sermon. And the title of this sermon was Why America May Go to Hell. Why America May Go to Hell. Now, in this sermon, he drew from the Luke parable about Dives and Lazarus. It is not wealth that puts you in hell. It's ignoring the humanity of the poor. King was assassinated before he could ever deliver that sermon. But as we look at the condition of the poor today, if that's the criteria, we might be able to join King and say, America still might be going to hell. King kept reminding people that the goal of the struggle was not only the right to vote or to sit in front of a bus, but to give birth to a new society based on love and justice. At the beginning of the movement, you had 10% of the population that's trying to transform the entire country by ending segregation. They had no army, no newspaper, no TV network. And actually, it wasn't even all the 10% of minority. It was like a minority within a minority that's trying to do this. And the minority of the minority, a lot more out each other's throats. So the point being is that you don't need majorities to make social change, right? The few always pay the price for the many. So as we move from a yes, we can era into a I alone can fix the problem era, I think the King legacy becomes more and more relevant. In his last book, King raises the question, where do we go from here? The world was growing, this is 1968. He says the world is growing more and more interdependent. He talks about stuff like, hey, we could travel from New York to London. The atom bomb can destroy people, he says, in countries that we don't know about. And he talks about the interdependence of things. And he also talks about the strong reactionary forces that keep people divided. And his message in this book was one thing: we need each other. King saw the hidden wholeness beneath the brokenness and division of humanity. He didn't see the choice as being between black or white, Republican or Democrat, straight or gay. He said the choice is between chaos or community. We can live together as brothers and sisters, or we perish together as fools. To follow the path of genuine community, the King believes we had to go or undergo a radical revolution of values, where we transform from a thing-centered society to a person-centered society. So if America goes to hell, it's her choice. And it's quite possible. I mean, it's possible that America is so deeply wedded to a death instinct that she's locked into patterns of division and self-destruction where human beings will be permanently treated like garbage. But King calls us to be more morally courageous. He reminds us that while elections are important, what's more important is the kind of person and society we're trying to become. Are we becoming more inclusive, or are we becoming more restrictive? King calls us to shed the scales from our eyes and see the hidden wholeness, which he refers to as beloved community, that is set out within us and before us. And with this realization, we are able to hew out of the mountain of political despair the stone of hope. With this, we will be able to transform the discords of our nation into a symphony of brotherhood and sisterhood. Thank you.
All right. So, in this area, who feels so inspired to any questions, comments, things? Stay under a minute.
How much do you think the disassociation of white evangelicals, for lack of a better term, who worked for justice in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, is tied to the individualistic American exceptionalism ideology that was fused with the binding of hippie culture and Christianity in places like Calvary Chapel, where the ideology is me and Jesus one-to-one, which allows the disconnection of the text and the disconnection of salvation happens communally here and now in the kingdom of heaven for all being engaged with. And that is one of the bifurcating problems of why you have white evangelicals who worked for social justice, who were involved in sanctuary movement, somehow going through cognitive dissonance and voting in support of things that actually run counter to their ideologies.
Wow. Okay, that was a mouthful. Okay.
Somebody read their assigned reading.
Well, I could attempt to respond to that. Let me use King. At the same time King was around, people forget that Billy Graham was around too, right? Billy Graham was actually doing revivals at the same time King was fighting for segregation. And most evangelicals, followed Graham while he was talking about this personal salvation and, give your hand to the preacher and his soul to the Lord. And they looked at King as crazy because they were like, why are you out there breaking the law when you're a Christian minister? You should be talking about salvation. So King's response, and people don't really talk about it enough, is that he gave a new definition of Christian salvation and talked about that you can't just talk about the soul of humans when they live in hellish conditions, right? Part of the Lord's Prayer is about on earth as it is in heaven, that the conditions on earth should reflect the conditions of heaven, right? King was in that spirit of trying to transform the conditions on earth to make them reflective of the conditions in heaven, in terms of that. So King really critiqued and gave an alternative paradigm for what it means to be a follower of Jesus. To be a follower of Jesus is to understand that our personhood is not just a disembodied soul, but a soul that is inside a body. So it's the whole person, not just an aspect, a privileged aspect of it.
I don't remember how this question was phrased exactly, but when you brought up the hope that King had towards the end of his time, it had me thinking of what do you do, or what have you noticed with the way in which people use hope to keep exploitation in place. So with the current election, rural America, their hope was in maintaining and regaining a status quo and the harm that they have received. And so how do you hold those tensions when hopes don't seem to align?
Yeah, so you said that the election, the hope was
middle class America and like rural America. So them voting for Trump or the reestablishment of America great again, the hope that as industrial America started to decline, the promises that they had as privileged Americans were taken away. And so hope for them looked like regaining off the exploitation of others.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, because hope is always tied to the imagination, right? Like there's a certain envisioning of what embodies hope, right? And from a kind of Christian standpoint, there's a distinction between optimism and hope. Like optimism, people are optimistic. They really believe that the evidence points toward a certain type of future, preferred future. But hope is like not looking, it's not, it's realizing the evidence might not point to that, but we can transform the evidence, in terms of that through our faith. So what King thought, that history is malleable, that it's changeable, that you're not fated in a certain direction, but that human beings can inject into the veins of civilization a new hope for humanity. And his idea of hope, at least from a Christian sociological vision, was always had to be connected to the biblical principle of not just loving your neighbor, but loving the least of your neighbors. Right? So it had to somehow embody a vision, a kind of Matthew 25 vision, that was connected to that. And that might look differently in different kind of certain contexts, but it was about solidarity with the poor in terms of that. Now, there are, you can hope. I mean, Nazis had a hope, right? Oppressions have a hope too. But if you're talking about it from a Christian perspective, there is a certain consistency to the biblical witness that is always pointed toward the vulnerable and disadvantaged.
Hi, my name's Devin. Hello. Thank you so much for sharing today. I thank you. That was very thoughtful and moving, and I believe. And yet, I feel so demoralized after this election season and all that's happened that my question is more of like a reality-based one. How do we live? Like, how do you live? How do we do this now? In a way that lives in community, that has hope, and something bigger, but it feels still so crushing at the same time.
That's an excellent question. And I felt the immediate shock of the election had me a bit demoralized too. So I resonate with that. What I think I've come to a point, though, is that we have to use a sports metaphor, play small ball. Like, instead of always trying to hit a home run, get a base hit. Get a base hit. Get on base. Do what you can. Just practice love and kindness in your context, right? Like that one thing in your context that makes sense. The way you try to get out of a rut is you have to do the next right thing, right? The next right thing. You mess up, you do the next right thing. And we have to do the next right thing until there's a collective coming together and history opens for the opportunity. Because what happens is that there are certain, constellation of circumstances that create levers of opportunity for social change. But those are some things that are out of our control to make massive social change, like in the 60s. But we don't just sit idly by waiting for that. We still keep active in our daily kind of practice and our faith practices and our political practices and our cultural practices. So we need to keep grounded and active in that. And then the invitation of history will open up at some point, and we're able to capitalize on that. So to me, it's being present in the moment and not having anxiety about the future, right? That's kind of what faith is about, right? Like there's a theologian, Paul Tillich, thought that anxiety was a modern sin, right? If you have faith, faith means trust, confidence. And to have anxiety, human beings are one of the only living creatures that can have anxiety because we're always projecting about the future. You're an animal who can't think about the future. You don't have anxiety because you're living right now. So you're not worried about possible alternative futures. You're just living right now. And I think we might have to take our cue from other living creatures and just live in the moment and not be so anxious about certain things. I mean, we have to have some type of projection, that type of thing, but we can't be so caught that we become paralyzed by that. So my point being is that we should really, my sense of things is that we have to do what we can in our personal circumstances. And at some point, there'll be a critical mass that's able to change the levels of culture so we can make deeper forms of transformation.